As Ciara said, I'm just going to talk to you this morning just about the recent publication on bringing back homes, a little bit around the background to the document, the policy around it, and the manual itself, and the recent amendments to the building control regulations that Fionnuala just referred to. So the overall government policy of Rebuilding Ireland is about supporting, it's under 5 pillars: addressing homelessness, accelerating social housing, building more homes, improving the rental sector, and also utilising existing houses. So there's a commitment there to bring vacant properties and underused properties back into reuse for residential purposes. So the objective under Pillar 5 is to ensure that the existing stock is used to the maximum extent possible, and focusing on measures that will bring the existing stock back into reuse. So a review of Rebuilding Ireland in 2017 added additional measure to look and see how we could support and facilitate the reuse of existing buildings, particularly those that are in upper floor accommodations over shops, and the upgrading of vacant properties. And that was, I suppose, the primary objective then, to develop some guidance to support that. In tandem with that recommendation over the course of last year, you may be familiar with the National Vacant Housing Reuse Strategy. It's published by the Vacant Homes Unit in the department, and that has the overarching policy around bringing vacant properties back into reuse. It does go into a lot of detail about the statistics around vacancy, and it's quite an interesting read from that perspective, and how the regional distribution is, and the reasons for vacancy. And there's a myriad of reasons why these properties are underused and vacant. The local authorities are responsible for vacant homes actions plans, and also the establishment of a vacant homes office. So there's now a central person within a local authority that has the responsibility of looking at the vacancy in the local authority, and where it's in an area of demand, to look at the measures and contact the homeowner, and to ensure that the incentives that are available are communicated to those homeowners to bring these properties back into reuse. As part of, I suppose, some of the media reports and our own, the CSO would have statistics based on the 2016 census that there's upwards towards 200,000 properties vacant. Now that was on the basis of the census, which vacancy would have been measured by means of a simple, we knocked 3 times and you weren't there. The statistics section in the department has drilled down into that data and has conducted some pilot studies in a number of regions throughout the country at the moment, including Cork City. Apologies for the boundary there. Under the Action 5.21 of Rebuilding Ireland, a working group was set up which I chaired, in terms of looking at the issue of vacancy and how we could produce some guidance to support demystifying the regulations, finding out what the problems are with the practitioners, the homeowners, the landlords themselves, and the local authorities. So a working group was established. We wanted to provide clarity to the industry, to all people involved in this space, and to also develop a report for the Minister on readily actionable items which he could easily implement going forward. The deliverables out of that process was a report of the working group on the reuse of existing buildings, and you can access that from the department's website, and the manual. And as Ciara said, there's copies of that manual at reception. So the manual itself is developed to support and facilitate the reuse of existing buildings, and the objective overall is to increase the number of viable properties. It has a broad aim at owners, members of the public, and local authorities and those involved in the construction industry, and giving them clear guidance as to what the rules are, why they're there, and how we can, I suppose, commonly understand how to apply them and manage each other's expectations throughout the process. So the main regulations then that affect the design and build of and use of buildings would be, you've got the planning system, is it the right type of building, is it in the right location, is it sustainable, is it built at the right time. The exempted development regulations, which came in March of 2018, they arise from a commitment to review the planning legislation to look at vacant commercial properties to see how they could be brought back into reuse without having to go through the planning process. And subject to a number of conditions associated with it, it would have benefits of, I suppose, removing the requirement of the planning application, and also the development contributions that are associated with that. It reduces the administrative burden, and it leads to more positive impacts and project timeframes, costs, etc. Fionnuala touched on the specific regulations affecting older buildings. These are outlined in the manual. Generally protected structures, National Monuments Act, special areas of conservation. Striking the balance is very important between the competing agendas of accessibility and conservation, and it's getting that balance right that will enable these properties to come back into reuse as well. The building control system is something that I'm primarily responsible for. So, the control system as well is about protection of the safety of people in and about buildings. So, it's vital to bring properties back into reuse as quickly as possible, but it has to be done in a safe and a sustainable manner as well, so that we don't have a legacy of bad buildings going forward. I have to make a positive contribution to building stock. The minimum standards in rented accommodation, I suppose that you have to be conscious of them in terms of what the desired use of that building is. Is it for your own use, or is it to be rented to the public? And those minimum standards in rented accommodation are about securing, I suppose, a sustainable future for the rental sector, making sure that members of the public have a safe level and a safe and quality level of accommodation provided to them. The duties then of the people that are involved in the construction are outlined in the Safety, Health and Welfare Work Act, and finally the Fire Services Act. We go into a little bit of detail about the persons that are in control of premises, their responsibilities and obligations to manage the fire safety of that building. So what the manual does is break the process down into some simple steps from the start of having the concept of bringing a building back into reuse, asking a series of questions that will I suppose, inspire you to look at, I suppose, the significance of the building, what its potential uses are, what the grants are available, asking all of the things that sometimes can be the tipping point between whether something is economically viable or not. What are the costs of the proposed work? Are there site constraints that would affect the economic viability of such a reuse? So, I suppose with everything, it's regulation is one thing, and we can talk all day about maybe what Part M does and what Part B does, but we wanted to make this manual meaningful, something that everyone can relate to in the types of buildings that you see as underused every day, in every street, in every village in Ireland. So we've taken a number of typical buildings. We call it the low-hanging fruit, the ones that are readily achievable, increasing with complexity from the existing dwelling that just wants to come back into reuse as an existing dwelling, two-storey building over the shop accommodation, three-storey, and then the multi-storey non-dwelling. And the document then elaborates as we go through what the actual regulatory approval part would be for those types of buildings. So out of 4 typical buildings, we've identified 13 reuse options, and they can range from various subdivisions of the properties. We've asked the questions about, do I need planning permission for this? Do I need a fire safety certificate? Do I need a disability access certificate? Sometimes through the course of our work, we found that there's a lot of confusion about the administration of building control, and people sometimes in doubt if they can't get a clear answer as to, do I need a fire cert? Maybe you don't, but I'll apply for one anyway. So it creates burden where it's particularly unnecessary. This document is here to demystify all of that and give a clear direction for everyone involved. So we take each of the reuse options and work through them and look at the typical scales of intervention. So it's working from, I suppose, from both ends to document that it has to be somewhat appealing to the non-technical expert, and we, I suppose, grade it towards, I suppose, getting a little bit more detail as we get towards the rear of the document. So people can get a handle on what work is involved and an understanding of the complexity as subdivision is incorporated into the reuse options. And I suppose then, as a summary, that's a very valuable one-pager to actually be able to tell you what exactly is required in terms of your planning, fire safety, DAC, etc. And there will be other permits that are required that are outlined in the rear of the document as well. One of the, I suppose, the criticisms that we have had in the past is the speed by which I can get the site and the barriers to that. And I suppose there's a traditional way of, I suppose, with the if you can avail of the planning exemption, it's simply a notification 2 weeks before you plan to start on site from a planning perspective, and we're building a commencement notice is required for the particular options as they're outlined on the left-hand column. There's a choice to be made whether you want to go a traditional route, that you give a notice to the local authority that you're going to start within 14 and 28 days, or you can start with a 7-day notice. So just to elaborate on the typical kind of technical interventions that are for some of the reuse options, the low-hanging fruit, that would be the over-the-shop accommodation. We've essentially just taken the regulations and applied it as they would to this change of use. So it gives a concept of the possible works outlined. Now, I suppose when I start into subdivision, I need everything that was on my previous slide plus this. So subdivision can become has more safety concerns associated with it. We've got the fire protection, we've got sound insulation requirements. So there are inevitably greater works associated with it. The document, I suppose, the best way of kind of being able to share I suppose a vision as to where this has been done before is to give good examples of this. This particular one in Waterford City was it's a €200 property. It's simply brought back into reuse as a dwelling. The owner had an E one, I think, of a BER. It was upgraded to a C2. The owner entered into a lease agreement under the repair and leasing scheme with the local authority for 20 years to cover the costs associated with the build, which were in the range of 40,000. So a fine example of a simple intervention at a quarter of the cost of a new build to bring an existing property back into reuse. One that I've just picked out as well that I think it's quite sympathetic to I suppose a planner's view and a conservation architect's view is this one in Dunleary, where the shop itself was simply brought back into reuse as a dwelling without modification of the shop front, and they installed a screen in front of the shop window to give that privacy. But from a local authority perspective, the streetscape didn't change. A new home has been established, and in an area of Dunleary, which I suppose if people are familiar with Dunleary, it's it's a bit of a ghost town in terms of a lot of these shops closing. So, and it's in an area of high demand. So that's that actual shop, that person involved was in an article in the Irish Times as well. So a very fine example of how simple it can be to bring a commercial property back into reuse. Now, if it was under the exempted development regulations, that would not require planning. It would simply require notification to the local authority. I think it was done before this. So the appendices then, to go into, I'm not going to drill into detail, but I'm happy to clarify anything in the document as much as I can. There is we cover the exempted development regulations, given the broad practical implementation of them on the ground, and people talked about minimum floor areas, etc. That's all detailed in the document. We have a section on the application of the building regulations to works to existing buildings. Fionnuala covered a bit of that already. The minimum standard in rented accommodation. What do we mean by that, and what the obligations are, and the licences. There can be a myriad of licences required, from skips, from road opening, hoarding licences. Depending on whether you're in a tight urban situation, it's going to affect you more or less. And I suppose dealing with historic buildings as well, the utilities associated with it. We could think that we can change a 4-storey building into a number of flats, but there may be pressures from a utility provision perspective, water provision. There may be lead pipes in the building. All of these things would have to be understood at the start so that you can build it into your costs associated with it. Finally, all of the assistance, the grants and incentives that are available as they currently stand are as up to date as possible, and they're outlined in the document. Covering the broad area then of the simple questions is like, I suppose we're appealing to a broad audience. What is a commencement notice? What is a fire cert? And there's a number of frequently asked questions to help support that. So I'm just going to go quickly through this. Just in terms of the working group, recommended a review of the building control regulations, and this was in keeping with the terms of reference to try and streamline the processes associated with the bringing back into reuse. So for material change of use is defined by section 3.3 of the Act, and certain parts of the regulation apply to material change of use, and these are outlined in Article 13, but they only apply to specific buildings, excluding, I suppose, so when we talk about residential reuse, those are the parts of the regulations that apply when a building undergoes a change of use to a dwelling, and there's some notable absences there. So With that information, at the moment, what we looked at was the administrative process around applications for certificates. Now, I suppose when the Disability Access Certificate was introduced in 2009, the legislation itself piggybacked on the need to have a fire cert, and that was a common, I suppose, way of implementing something that was new to the system. I suppose we have our 10 years of learning since then, and we have looked at at those provisions, and we decided, and we advised the Minister and to give clarity to both the professionals and for building control, so that there was no confusion about what applied and what didn't apply. We introduced a new provision that essentially repeats the provisions of Article 11 A to E, with some exceptions. The material alteration to build and contain a flat was not carried over, and Article 11E elaborates specifically the types of buildings that Part M applies to. So in that way, it's and similarly with the exemptions that apply, there's a number of exemptions that are associated with the fire cert. Those are replicated, with the exception that they're no longer prohibitive to the number of stories involved. A common complaint as well that we have picked up on is that Part M itself does not apply to buildings or parts of buildings that are subject to maintenance, repair, inspection. So we thought it was a good opportunity to clarify that aspect as well, so that it's black and white for everyone to read, rather than argue a point continuously. These most recent changes have been incorporated into an administrative consolidated version of the building control regs. That takes all of the SIs since 1997 and groups them into one. So you can access that at that link. It's important that I do say that those changes in the building control regulations did not change the application of Part M. This is a control process. It's about reducing the number of applications that are required. The requirement of a DAC is separated from the requirement for a fire safety certificate, and we've provided clarification on the classes of buildings to which a DAC applies to. And also, as I mentioned, the DAC wouldn't be required for buildings subject to inspection, repair and maintenance. So the Bringing Back Homes manual is fully inclusive of that SI, and it's the most up-to-date, I suppose, reference that I'd be encouraging everyone to pick up, have a look, and get familiar with it. And hopefully it's going to give clarity to you in your questions. Just to say, the Vacant Homes Officer in the local authorities, he has a specific responsibility to be aware of this guidance, to be the front of house person, to be able to disseminate it, be the liaison between the expertise that lies underneath, the fire officer, conservation, everyone within the local authority, to arrange a meeting if necessary to resolve some of these issues. So the official launch of this document is on the 10th of April. So there's an email address there on the Vacant Homes Unit. It's in Athlone, and the Minister will be launching it, and it's another day where, you know, these events are really useful, like, you know, to be able to help disseminate the information. The challenge essentially is not making the publication, it's getting the message out there so that we can have a common understanding and we can move forward, you know, in a practical and efficient way when we're dealing with reuse in this time of need. So thanks very much.